Chapter 2. Socialism. The Politics of Fallen Man. You shall not steal. Exodus 20, verse 15. When it comes to humanism, which, as we saw in the last chapter, is the religion of fallen man, we need to keep in mind that this religion of fallen man also has a political component as well. Not only is the humanist a person with religious convictions, he is also a person with political convictions as well. Since his religious convictions will always lead him to develop a system of man-centered political contrivances, it follows quite naturally and logically that the humanist will pursue socialism as his political order. The reason for this is because, in his arrogance, the humanist has declared God to be dead, revolting against God and God's sovereignty. As a result, he must assert that he himself is alive and well and is the ultimate presupposition, thus removing God and asserting himself as the sovereign. Sovereignty presupposes jurisdiction, and jurisdiction requires a law order. However, the challenge for the humanist is this. In order for him to structure the world, he must develop a coherent social order that coincides with his religious presuppositions. Considering the fact that he hates God and will not submit to him, he is now forced to relinquish and renounce individual liberty because only the transcendent and triune God of the heavens grants a man individual liberty. Man cannot grant another man liberty. He can only rule over him or serve him. Civil government does not grant freedom. It can only chip away at freedom and take it away altogether. The only way to answer the dialectical problem of the one and the many, individual liberty versus the collective of all mankind, the humanist has to allow the Hegelian model which eliminates one of those, and thus he favors the collective over against the individual. As a side note, it was Cornelius Van Til who taught that all non-biblical thought is inherently dialectical, and consequently, Christianity is the only possible way to solve the dilemma of the one and the many. And this is solved because the ultimately one and many is the triune Godhead. At any rate, because man in his sin rejects the transcendency of God, he must develop his system from his own self-generated religious convictions. Consequently, he chooses the collective as taking primacy over the individual, and this is because he hates the liberty that God's law grants him. I did not say something wrong here. The humanist hates the liberty that God's law grants to him. Rejecting God's law leads to tyranny, not freedom. Its rejection does not liberate a man, it enslaves him. Tyranny exists because men would much rather have someone else to do the governing than do the hard work and discipline of self-governance. More on that later. Now, when we talk about socialism, we would be remiss to leave out of the picture the most influential man behind the socialist vision, and that being communism's chief thinker, Karl Marx. Karl, what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine, Marx, was a constantly quarreling wild donkey of a man. He spent his nights drinking and talking and often spent his days sleeping on the couch in the clothes he wore the previous day. Marx, whose anger was a tremendous problem, would often say to the people he didn't like, "I will annihilate you," which is interesting coming from a man whose health was always a problem, who was without personal hygiene and whose self-control was so lacking that he squandered the money he borrowed from friends and family. Once he pursued a job, and really only once. He was a burly, surly curmudgeon whose ideas, once they got out there, most certainly led to the mass murder of nearly 100 million people through the vehicle of communism. In 1848, he, along with his friend Friedrich Engels, published the Communist Manifesto, and in it they painted their eschatological vision for the destruction of capitalism and anything remotely close to the Christian faith. This piece of literature has influenced more people than any other piece of literature in history, second only to the Bible. Marx's philosophy was simple. Socialism cannot be brought into existence without revolution. And revolution was indeed the vision of a man whose demons poisoned him to the point of usurping anything close to individual liberty. This, too, is ironic, given the life of Marx. His book, Capital, was a self-deceived concoction consisting of plagiarism, outdated information, and a refusal to see or state the facts. One example will suffice. Marx wrote a chapter essentially critiquing the working conditions of men in the capitalistic factories during the Industrial Revolution in England. He never once stepped foot in a factory. In fact, much of the information he used was outdated 5, 10, even 20 years from the time of his writing. Capitalism most certainly self-corrected those problems, as the free market always does, but Marx conveniently ignored the facts in order to push his demonic agenda. Speaking of Marx's complete and utter hypocrisy, his own mother poked a hole in his entire philosophy when she wished that Karl would accumulate capital instead of just writing about it. It is well known and established that Marx's personality was devoid and defunct of integrity. So how does someone like him impact so many around the world? The answer has several layers, but we will start with the simple concept of vision. Despite the trouble outlined previously, we know that the man whose liver always gave him trouble could still see. He was a distressed revolutionary whose anger, strife, and lack of self-control fueled a fire for inexorable covetousness and greed. Only when a person is completely bereft of integrity and self-government under God can he come up with an eschatological vision of mass destruction. And yes, it was a vision of mass destruction. Do not be deceived. Marx had a vision for the future which cannot be said of the modern church. On one level, sin and rebellion are the seeds of humanism. This goes all the way back to the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden, when they wanted to know and determine good and evil for themselves, Genesis 3, verse 5. On another level, this isn't merely a metaphysical thing. Those seeds, planted in the anti-Semitic heart of Marx, sprouted forth into a comprehensive, all-of-life vision for society, and thus it produced the politics of fallen man, what we call socialism. Before we unpack this dangerous doctrine some more, let's look at the text before us. Exodus 20 verse 15 reads, quote, "You shall not steal," end quote. The word steal means to take by stealth, or to take or remove something secretly without the knowledge of the person who possesses it. Implicit within this command is the notion of private property. For someone to steal something means the forced removal of a possession from someone else, and it logically follows then that the thing being possessed had its rightful owner. What we call the negativism of the law is clear. Do not steal. Do not do this. However, as is the case in biblical law, there is a positivism to it. Acknowledge and respect private property. Generate wealth and support others voluntarily in this process. We might even say that inferred within this law is the notion of giving freely to those in need. The Bible lays out a vision for private property when it says things like, quote, "The earth is the Lord's, and all that is in it, the world, and those who live in it," end quote. Psalm 24, verse 1. Also found in the Bible is Psalm 50, verses 10 through 12, which also reads, quote, "For every wild animal of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the air, and all that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and all that is in it is mine." End quote. What is explicit throughout the entirety of the Bible is the fact that God grants dominion to man, but he does not grant ultimate sovereignty. The ultimate owner and landlord of all property on earth is God, who created all of it. This exercise of ultimate sovereignty is not delegated to man. In short, man is given private property and jurisdiction over material things from the hand of God, who owns it all. This is a derivative sovereignty, what we might call a sovereignty of material stewardship under God. The earth is the Lord's, this is true, but it is also given to man to steward and subdue, to work and keep and build the kingdom of God on this earth as it is in heaven. Christian theology, labor, and work is tied to man's responsibility before God. We do not work as punishment for our sin. We work because this was God's intention all along, to fill the earth and subdue it, to make it fruitful and productive. All of which is to say, private property is a doctrine that is derived from the Bible and from the mind of God. It is a real concept, and anytime anyone gets this right, it is because of the Christian worldview which grants coherence to these ideas. Theft, which is a sin and a violation of God's law order, is not just a transaction between men, it is a sin against God. God demands that we treat one another with respect and dignity, and this is accomplished in all of our relationships when we don't steal things from each other. Listen, there is never going to be a justifiable doctrine and political philosophy that can possibly overturn the eighth commandment, regardless of what man says. We cannot rationalize our way into violating this commandment, saying things like, well, I needed this particular thing more than he did. Nor can we justify the violation of this commandment by saying things like, well, if the state does it, it's okay. God's sovereignty and the administration of his law word demands that his law take precedent and priority over everything else. The only legitimate way to obtain wealth is through work, inheritance, or gift. That's it. We are called to work via the dominion mandate, and we cannot circumvent this calling by stealing from others. This is where socialism comes in. It's no secret that the first of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto reads, quote, abolition of private property in land and application of all rents of land to his public purpose, end quote. In order for Marx to achieve his eschatological vision for a dictatorship at the hands of the proletariat, he had to get rid of the most foundational element of a free society under God, private property. Once Marx could seize land, he could then carry out the rest of his agenda, a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax, abolition of all rights and inheritance, confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly, centralization of the means of communication and transportation in the hands of the state, grow the state's ownership of factories and means of production, equal obligation of all to work and the establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture, combine agriculture and manufacturing industries, and get rid of the distinction between town and country and distribute people evenly. Free education in government schools. If you read all of that without me telling you it was Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, you would probably think I was talking about America. Well, the truth is, America is a socialist country, and America doesn't seem to care, Christians included. According to Friedrich Hayek, quote, socialism means the abolition of private enterprise, of private ownership of the means of production, and the creation of a system of planned economy, in which the entrepreneur working for profit is replaced by a central planning body, end quote. Socialism itself began with a much simpler definition, and that being, quote, government ownership of the means of production, end quote. But as Hayek carefully nuances, this definition evolved a bit in the 20th century, and now it means the redistribution of income in pursuit of equality. Not through government ownership of labor and means of production per se, but through institutions of the welfare state and progressive income tax. In other words, the goal has always been this elusive equality, but the means have shifted a bit. As Orwell put it in Animal Farm, quote, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, end quote. It is ironic that the socialist vision for equality is anything but equality, especially when it comes to the progressive income tax, The rich are taxed more, and thus they are not equal under law. America has tinkered with the socialist practice of income tax since 1913. Socialism is the political choice of fallen man because socialism is the answer to man's quest for a social order built on his religious presuppositions. In other words, humanism as a philosophy doesn't do anything to build a social order. There's no tangible vision in ethereal concepts, no practical day-to-day dealings with economics and law and order. For the humanist to make his vision for society come to fruition, he has to look to socialism, and here's why. I mentioned briefly a bit ago the problem of the one and the many. In philosophy, there's always a dialectical tension between the individual and the collective. Which matters more, the individual or the group? The one person or everyone together? As Christians who understand that God has revealed himself to us in Christ and through his word, we know that we're the only ones who can solve this dilemma. That doesn't mean that the humanists won't try. The problem of the one and the many is not solved by eliminating one in favor of the other. Statism, and thus socialism, erroneously overemphasizes the collective at the expense of the individual. The whole socialist scheme centralizes everything, bringing it into one. Everything is done via central planning. The elite group at the top, who are more equal than others, dictate to the rest at the bottom what the central planning goals are to be. They are the rulers, and we are told that we must trust them. The humanist must do this in order to carry out his vision for the future. Marx had to cut to the foundation of property rights granted from God in order to see a revolution. All material things come from God's hand. Thus, everything that is given to us or earned by us is from his gracious storehouses. If we begin here, we can start with the abolition of this very concept of God's ownership and our derivative ownership, and then we can get on with imposing our collectivist vision. People are induced to steal the goods and possessions of others because they do not trust God, therefore pollute themselves with greed and covetousness. Marx hated capitalism and anything related to it, especially the Jews. So what must he do? He must take from them. In his lust, he must take from them and break the eighth commandment in the process. This is the core of the socialist agenda. Theft. The socialist mantra, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, is nothing more than smoke and mirrors sloganeering. Whether it's the fascism of Benito Mussolini in Italy, the communism of Stalin in Soviet Russia, or the German fascism which arrived in full swing with Hitler himself, the common denominator in all of this is individuals can and should be sacrificed for the greater good of the collective. The solution for Marx and others like him was to simply remove the individual from the equation. You are not human. You have no rights. This is why Jews in the ghettos and concentration camps were given numbers instead of names. Here's the thing. Man was created to be free. But this freedom, this liberty, could only be exercised and ascertained by man in subordination to God. The only true freedom and liberty a man can possess is that which is in service and obedience to God. Because of this, paganism will always need statism, or the collective, through the means of socialism in order to control and manage the individual. Pagan man can never be free because pagan man will only submit to a self-created Godhead and a self-created social order. All unbiblical thinking will result in the collective taking precedence over the individual. Always. This is why Hillary Clinton can speak of all the children as being the property of the state. All socialists say these things because that's part of the scheme. Republicans and other ostensible conservatives are no different when they speak of our public schools. In response, what must we do as Christians at every turn is to insist on individual liberty. And I'll tell you this much, it's going to be very hard to do this because socialism has run through just about everything in our country. From public schools and excessive taxation to inheritance taxes and price controls, socialism is here and it will not go away without the Christian vision for a coherent social order based on God's law and God's prescription for individual liberty. Socialism is a dangerous doctrine, forged from the political and religious fires of God-denying humanism. Socialism destroys entrepreneurial ingenuity, technological advancement, and economic improvement because it robs a man of the incentive to fulfill the dominion calling God has placed upon him. Everything socialism has touched, it has destroyed. There are no redeeming qualities, and thus it is completely and entirely incompatible with the Christian faith. Entrepreneurship and technological advancement can only come from the hands of a man who is not only believes himself to be free, but is truly and objectively free to explore the world that God has created. You do not get the iPhone from a tyrannical, totalitarian regime who wants to control and dictate not only the labor of a man, but the vision of a man. So, we must fight against it. We must not participate in the socialistic schemes of modern America. We must refrain from taking the government's cheese and free education. We must be diligent in getting this message to the masses, starting locally and starting today. There is so much work to be done to combat this ginormous problem, and we have no time to waste. We must pray, and we must fight, and we must not see this as secondary. This is primarily because the gospel of the kingdom of God is entirely opposed to socialism.